The crisis has begun in the US. Americans can't buy anything anymore. You know what? I've been watching the economic numbers come in week after week, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you anymore. We're witnessing something that should terrify every single American right now. The crisis isn't coming. It's already here, and it's hitting families across this country like a freight train. While politicians on both sides keep telling us the economy is resilient and fundamentally strong, I want you to look at what's actually happening to real people. Because the data I'm about to share with you paints a picture that is absolutely devastating. Just last week, I was talking to a teacher in Ohio, someone who's supposed to be middle class, right? She told me she's putting groceries on her credit card because her paycheck doesn't last the whole month. A teacher, in America, having to choose between paying rent and buying food. And she's not alone. This is becoming the new normal for millions of working Americans. The corporate media wants to tell you everything is fine because the stock market is hitting record highs. But let me ask you something. When was the last time your portfolio helped you pay for gas? When did your 401k buy your groceries? The disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street has never been wider, and it's crushing ordinary families. Let me start with the most shocking number that came out just last month. Americans now owe a staggering $182 trillion in credit card debt. Think about that for a second. That's trillion with a T. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of most countries. It's more than what we spend on defense. It's a number so large it's almost incomprehensible. The average American household is now carrying $6,580 in credit card debt. And here's the kicker, that's up 26% from just 3 years ago when inflation started its rampage. But the real story is hidden in the details. Generation X, people in their 40s and 50s who should be in their peak earning years, are carrying an average of over $9,200 in credit card debt. These are people who did everything right. They went to college, they got jobs, they bought houses, and they're drowning. But wait, it gets worse. Nearly half of all credit card holders, 46%, are carrying a balance from month to month. That means 46% of people with credit cards can't pay them off. They're trapped in a cycle of minimum payments and compound interest. And get this, almost a quarter of those people, 23%, don't think they'll ever pay it off. Ever. We're talking about people who have essentially given up hope of financial freedom. Think about what that means psychologically. Nearly a quarter of Americans with credit card debt have accepted that they will never be financially free. They've given up on the American dream. That's not an economic statistic. That's a human tragedy. Now, the establishment economists want you to believe this is just people being irresponsible with their money. They'll point to statistics about consumer spending and tell you people are just buying too many lattes and avocado toast. But that's complete garbage. And here's why. When you dig into the data, you find that 45% of this debt comes from emergency expenses. Car repairs, medical bills, home repairs. These aren't people buying luxury items. These are Americans using credit cards to survive basic emergencies because they don't have savings. Your car breaks down. You need $200 to fix it to get to work, but you don't have $200 sitting around. So it goes on the credit card. Your kid gets sick, you have a $500 emergency room copay, but your checking account has $200. Credit card. Another 28% of credit card debt is coming from day-to-day expenses like groceries, childcare, and utilities. Let me repeat that. Americans are putting groceries on their credit cards because they can't afford food with their actual income. In the richest country in the world, people are going into debt to eat. They're financing their basic survival. And here's the most infuriating part. The same politicians and economists who created this mess are now blaming the victims. They're saying Americans need to be more responsible with their spending, while ignoring the fact that wages haven't kept up with the cost of living for decades. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely moved since the 1970s, but the cost of housing, healthcare, and education has exploded. And here's what's really twisted about this whole situation. The interest rates on these credit cards are absolutely brutal. We're talking about average APRs in the high teens and low 20s. Some people are paying 29.99% interest on basic necessities. So when someone puts $500 of groceries on their credit card because their paycheck didn't stretch far enough, They're potentially paying $600 or $700 for those same groceries by the time they finally pay it off, if they ever do. But it gets even more predatory than that. The credit card companies know exactly what they're doing. They're targeting people who are financially vulnerable with offers for more credit. Congratulations! You're pre-approved for a $5,000 credit limit. They're not doing this out of kindness. They're doing it because they know these people will struggle to pay it back, which means more interest payments, more fees, more profit. The average minimum payment on a $6,580 credit card balance is about $131 per month. But here's the cruel math. If you only make minimum payments at typical interest rates, it would take you over 6 years to pay off that balance, and you'd pay more than $3,000 in interest. That's almost half the original balance just in interest. The deck is completely stacked against working families. Now let's talk about what's driving this crisis, because it's not happening in a vacuum. Consumer spending, which powers about 2/3 of our entire economy, fell for the first time since January this year. And this isn't because people suddenly decided to be more frugal. People are literally running out of money to spend. Real disposable income, that's what's left after taxes, is only growing at 1.7% annually. Meanwhile, everything else is getting more expensive. Food prices are up, energy costs are up, housing costs are through the roof. So people have less real spending power, even as the things they need to buy keep getting more expensive. It's a perfect storm of economic pain. And here's the scary part. Consumer spending drives 2/3 of our economy. If consumer spending collapses because people are tapped out, the entire economy goes down with it. We're seeing early warning signs already. Retail sales have been inconsistent, and many companies are reporting that customers are trading down to cheaper alternatives or simply buying less. The Federal Reserve's own data shows that lower-income households are feeling the most pressure. Over half of low-income households, 51%, have had to trade down when buying meat and dairy products because prices have gotten so high. Even middle-class and upper-middle-class families are choosing cheaper brands and private labels more often than they used to. The housing market tells an even more devastating story. Mortgage rates are stuck around 7%, which is double what they were just a few years ago. Remember when people could get 30-year mortgages for under 3%? Those days are gone, probably forever. The median home price has exploded to over $407,000. And here's the brutal math. Buying that median-priced home now requires over a full year of household income, with monthly payments eating up 35% of the median earner's income. Let me put that in perspective for you. Financial advisors used to say you shouldn't spend more than 28% of your income on housing. Now, just to buy an average home, you need to spend 35% of your income, and that's if you can even qualify for a mortgage in the first place. Most banks want to see at least 20% down, which means you need to have $80,000 in cash just to put down on an average home. How many working families have $80,000 sitting around? This means homeownership has become impossible for an entire generation of Americans. First-time buyers are being completely locked out of the market. The percentage of first-time buyers has fallen to historic lows because young people simply cannot compete with cash buyers and investors. So they're forced to rent, often paying more in rent than they would pay for a mortgage, if they could qualify for one. And for people who rent, well, they're trapped too because rents keep climbing while their wages stagnate. The average rent in major cities is now consuming 40%, 50%, sometimes 60% of people's take-home pay. That leaves almost nothing for savings, emergencies, or anything that might help them escape the rental trap. The result is that we now have nearly 1/3 of major housing markets showing actual price declines. But don't get excited thinking that means homes are becoming affordable. They're still completely out of reach for most working families. What's happening is that the entire housing market is basically frozen. Existing homeowners can't sell because they'd have to give up their low-rate mortgages, and potential buyers can't afford to buy at these prices with these rates. So we have this bizarre situation where home prices are starting to fall in some markets, but homes are becoming less affordable, not more affordable. It's like watching a slow-motion car crash. The market is breaking down, but it's breaking down in a way that hurts everyone. Sellers can't sell, buyers can't buy, and renters are stuck paying ever higher rents. And here's the thing that really makes me angry. We know how to fix this. Other countries have figured out how to provide affordable housing for their citizens. But in America, we've decided that housing should be treated as a commodity for investors rather than a basic human need. Private equity firms are buying up single-family homes to turn into rentals. Foreign investors are parking money in empty condos. And meanwhile, teachers and firefighters can't afford to live in the communities they serve. But here's where it gets really scary. The delinquency rates on credit cards are climbing to levels we haven't seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The share of people who are 90 days or more behind on their credit card payments has jumped to over 12% of all balances. In the lowest income areas, the delinquency rates have exploded by 63% since 2021. That's not a typo, 63%. And remember, this is happening while unemployment is still relatively low. During the 2008 crisis, unemployment spiked to 10%, which explained why people couldn't pay their bills. Today, unemployment is around 4.2%, but we're seeing similar levels of financial distress. That means people who have jobs still can't afford their basic living expenses. Having a job is no longer enough to avoid financial disaster. Let me put this in perspective for you. During the 2008 crisis, we had a massive housing bubble burst, and unemployment spiked to 10%. Today, unemployment is relatively low at around 4.2%, but we're seeing credit card delinquencies at similar levels. That means people who have jobs still can't afford their basic living expenses. What's even more alarming is that these delinquency rates are rising fastest among people in higher credit score tiers. We're not just talking about people who were already financially marginal. We're talking about people who were considered good credit risks just a few years ago. The economic pressure is so intense that it's pushing previously stable families over the edge. And what's the response from our political and economic leadership? More of the same policies that got us here. Trump's tariffs, which are essentially taxes on consumers, are expected to drive prices even higher. Nearly half of Americans are already concerned that tariffs will make their credit card debt worse. Think about that. People are worried that government policy will make their existing debt problems even more unmanageable. The Congressional Budget Office is projecting that we could see a recession starting in the fourth quarter of this year, with real GDP potentially falling by 1.7% and unemployment rising to 6%. But here's what's really twisted. They're also projecting that this recession might be necessary to bring inflation under control. So the plan is essentially to make millions of people unemployed in order to stop prices from rising. That's the level of economic thinking we're dealing with. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is caught in an impossible position. They want to cut interest rates to help the economy, but they're terrified that doing so will reignite inflation. So they're essentially paralyzed while American families are drowning in debt. They're more concerned about abstract economic indicators than they are about real human suffering. And let's be honest about what's really happening here. The Fed's primary concern isn't American families. It's protecting the wealth of bondholders and maintaining the stability of financial markets. When push comes to shove, they'll sacrifice working families to protect the portfolios of the wealthy every single time. Here's what really makes me angry about this whole situation. The wealth gap is exploding. While working families are going into debt to buy groceries, the stock market hit record highs this year. The people who own assets, real estate, stocks, businesses, are seeing their wealth skyrocket, while the people who depend on wages for survival are falling further and further behind. Just look at the numbers. Total household wealth in America is at record highs, but that wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The top 10% of Americans own about 70% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% own essentially nothing. And during this crisis, that gap has gotten wider, not smaller. The wealthy have been able to lock in ultra-low mortgage rates on multiple properties. They've benefited from rising asset prices, and they have the cash to take advantage of opportunities when other people are forced to sell. Meanwhile, working families are using credit cards to buy food and falling further into debt every month. This isn't just an economic crisis, it's a moral crisis. We've created a system where basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and even food are becoming luxury goods that only the wealthy can afford without going into debt. And the people who designed this system are telling us it's working exactly as intended. And the saddest part, this was entirely predictable. When you combine decades of wage stagnation with the most aggressive monetary policy experiment in history, followed by supply chain disruptions and now protectionist trade policies, this outcome was inevitable. The people in charge knew this was coming, and they did it anyway. Every economist worth their salt warned that keeping interest rates at zero for over a decade would create massive asset bubbles. They warned that quantitative easing would primarily benefit wealthy asset holders. They warned that not addressing wage stagnation would create unsustainable consumer debt. And what did our leaders do? They ignored every warning and doubled down on the policies that created the problem. And now, when the inevitable crisis arrives, they're acting surprised. Nobody could have seen this coming, they say. This is an unprecedented situation, they claim. It's gaslighting on a massive scale. They knew exactly what would happen, and they chose to prioritize short-term political gains over long-term economic stability. So where does this leave us? Well, if you're one of the millions of Americans struggling with this reality, the first thing you need to understand is that this isn't your fault. You didn't cause wage stagnation. You didn't create the housing bubble. You didn't design a healthcare system that bankrupts people for getting sick. The system is broken, and it's broken by design. The second thing you need to understand is that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. The economic projections I've seen suggest that we're heading into a prolonged period of slow growth, high debt service costs, and continued affordability challenges. The soft landing that everyone was hoping for is looking less and less likely every month. We're seeing early signs that major retailers are preparing for a significant downturn. Companies are cutting inventory, reducing hiring, and preparing for weaker consumer demand. When Walmart and Target start getting nervous about consumer spending, you know things are bad. But here's what you can do. If you're carrying credit card debt, make paying it off your absolute top priority. I know that's easier said than done when you're using credit cards to buy necessities, but the interest rates on that debt are destroying your financial future. Cut every expense you can, take on extra work if possible, sell things you don't need, and throw everything at that debt. Look for ways to increase your income, even if it's just a few $100s a month. Drive for a rideshare company, do freelance work online, sell items on eBay, anything to generate extra cash that can go toward debt reduction. Every dollar you put toward high-interest debt saves you multiple dollars in future interest payments. If you're thinking about buying a house, honestly, you might want to wait unless you absolutely have to move. This market is unsustainable, and there are growing signs that we could see some price corrections in the coming years. Don't let FOMO push you into a decision that could destroy your financial future. The fear of missing out is exactly what real estate agents and mortgage brokers want you to feel. Instead of rushing into home ownership, focus on building up your emergency fund and improving your credit score. When the market does correct, and it will eventually, you'll be in a much better position to take advantage of opportunities. And most importantly, vote. Vote in every election, from local school board races to federal elections. The people making the policies that created this mess need to be held accountable. We need leaders who understand that an economy that works for Wall Street but destroys Main Street is not a successful economy. Support candidates who are talking about real solutions, things like affordable housing programs, healthcare reform, minimum wage increases, and policies that actually help working families instead of just enriching the already wealthy. Don't fall for politicians who blame individuals for systemic problems or who promise easy fixes that don't address root causes. Because here's the bottom line. This crisis is just getting started. The American dream of working hard, saving money, and building a better life for your family has become a nightmare for millions of people. And unless we fundamentally change course, it's going to get much worse. We're at a crossroads right now. We can continue down this path of increasing inequality, where a small group of wealthy elites accumulates more and more wealth while working families struggle to survive. Or we can choose a different path, one that prioritizes human dignity over corporate profits, one that treats housing and healthcare as human rights rather than commodities, one that builds an economy that actually works for everyone. The establishment wants you to believe that this is all normal, that this is just how modern capitalism works. But that's a lie. We've had broad-based prosperity before in this country, and we can have it again. but only if we're willing to admit that the current system isn't working for the vast majority of Americans and demand something better. Other countries have figured this out. They have universal health care, affordable housing, strong worker protections, and robust social safety nets, and their economies are doing just fine. The idea that we have to choose between economic growth and taking care of people is a false choice promoted by people who benefit from the current broken system. The crisis has begun, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story. The question is, are we going to do something about it, or are we going to keep pretending everything is fine while American families drown in debt? The choice is ours, and the time to make it is now. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking this is normal. It's not normal for people with full-time jobs to need credit cards to buy groceries. It's not normal for teachers and firefighters to be unable to afford homes in the communities they serve. It's not normal for medical bankruptcy to be a leading cause of financial ruin in the richest country in history. None of this is normal, none of it is acceptable, and none of it is sustainable. The American people deserve better than this rigged system that extracts wealth from working families and concentrates it in the hands of a small elite. We deserve an economy that rewards work, not just wealth. We deserve leaders who fight for us, not for their corporate donors. The data doesn't lie, even when the politicians do. The crisis is here, it's real, and it's affecting millions of families right now. The only question is whether we're going to demand the changes we need to fix it, or whether we're going to accept that this is just the way things are. I know what I'm choosing. The question is, what are you going to choose? And it's time we demanded it.